a statewide committee comprised of 26 public and private educators began the process of reviewing and revising the Kansas State Science Standards. 8 members of the writing committee crafted the standards and presented them to the State Board of Education. They became known as the Minority Report. After much discussion, it was decided that the best forum to address the issues was via formal public hearings. However, some in the Kansas science community have called for a boycott of the hearings, and representatives of state and national science groups have refused to testify. The American Association for the Advancement of Science CEO Alan Leshner stated, "AAAS respectfully declines to participate in these hearings." And he added, "The concept of evolution is well supported by extensive evidence and accepted by virtually every scientist." AAAS emphasized, "There is no significant controversy within the scientific community about the validity of evolution." However, the 23 experts that testified disagreed. They detailed major controversies surrounding chemical evolution, the origin of life, macroevolution, the origin of new body plans, and biological systems and common ancestry. Additional controversies identified relate to the definition of science and the mechanisms of evolution. In May of 2005, 23 experts testified during 3 days of hearings. The experts included 5 PhD biologists, 4 PhD biochemists, 3 PhD chemists, 1 PhD geneticist, 1 PhD quantum physicist, 2 PhD philosophers of science, 1 PhD professor of education, 3 biology teachers, a Muslim journalist, and an attorney. Dr. Bill Harris has a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Hanover College in Hanover, Indiana, and a PhD in nutritional biochemistry from the University of Minnesota. He was the developer of the Omega-3 Index, a new blood test to assess cardiovascular risk, for which he has gained international standing.
We have an obligation, we think, to teach origin science in the most neutral way possible, without religious bias, without naturalistic or philosophical bias. And that way we do the best science and we end up neutral with respect to the Constitution. In order to accomplish that, we require that all the data that's relevant, the scientific data that's relevant to the issues of chemical evolution and macroevolution, be put on the table. That the presentation of one side of that controversy, data supporting one side of that controversy, without the presentation of data that's contradictory to that hypothesis, is not scientifically acceptable and also biases the discussion. So in a word, our hope is that at the end of these hearings, we will be allowed to teach the controversy that does exist over origins. The strategy of our opponents has been to mischaracterize our position and actually to malign some of us who are presenting that position. They have consistently and remarkably, in my mind, refused to engage in a discussion of the scientific substance of the issue. Our opposition has chosen to fight this battle with name-calling. This is a posting on the Kansas Citizens for Science website, dated February 10th, 2005, was written by Liz Craig, who is a member of that organization involved with some of the public relations. My strategy at this point is the same as it was in 1999. Notify national and local media about what's going on and portray them in the harshest light possible as political opportunists, evangelical activists, ignoramuses, breakers of rules, unprincipled bullies, etc. There may be no way to head off another science standards debacle, but we can sure make them look like asses as they do what they do. Our target is the moderates who are not that well educated about the issues, not that well educated. We're talking about education here. Most of whom probably are theistic evolutionists. There's no way to convert the creationists. the methods of natural investigation. They don't invoke spiritual forces to account for what they observe in the world. They look for natural causes. And I think that's fine, look for natural causes. But when you don't find any natural causes, it's time to fess up and say we don't know. Instead of saying, well, there was a natural cause, we don't know what it was, but we have faith that that's what happened. So methodological naturalism really puts blinders, I think, on the search for truth, particularly in the area of origin science.
Why in the area of origin science?
Because that's a historical science. It doesn't get much more historical than billions of years ago. Nobody was there to know what happened. Nobody watched it. We cannot say with any surety how anything came to be. Every experiment, particularly in the origin of life field, where they attempted to use, quote, natural environments to produce even some of the simplest chemicals of life, have consistently failed. Since 1950s, they have failed and failed and failed and failed, and yet they are still in the textbooks presented as the plausible explanation for how life arose. But those experiments have failed. It's dishonest, in my view, to portray failures in the laboratory as successes in a textbook. The tremendous amount of data in scientific literature, particularly in biochemistry, but also in cosmology and many other places, that points, that has identified, I think, certainly since 1953, when DNA was, the code was cracked by Watson and Crick. What Watson and Crick discovered was a code. They discovered a code. Every other code in the world that we know of came from a mind. To conclude that DNA at some level somewhere originally came from a mind is not an irresponsible deduction from the data. When we look at some of the biochemical machines that are in cells, and some of our witnesses will attest to this, and maybe even show some pictures. And now that we understand how some of these fantastically complex machines that work inside the simplest cells, we can see them now. We understand them now. The advance in modern molecular biology has shown us a world that can only be explained, in my view, by positing some kind of a plan in a direction. I don't know who did it. I don't know how it was done. I don't know why it was done. I don't have to know any of that stuff to detect design. If I walked into my garage today and I found a 6-foot bacterial flagellum laying there and spinning at 100,000 RPM, I would have no idea what it was, besides maybe my weed whacker gone nuts. But I would have no question in my mind that it was a designed object. I would just not know what it was. But you can infer design just by examining something without knowing anything about where it came from.
Why do many mainstream scientists, evolutionists, if you will, refuse to accept the idea that DNA is a code?
Oh, no, I don't think anybody refuses. I just don't think they think about it very deeply.
Okay.
I mean, everybody knows it's a code. I just, in my opinion, they haven't sat down and taken a deep breath and said, where did that come from? And really think about the fact that the bonds along the backbone of the nucleic acid are sugar phosphate bonds. Every bond is identical. There's nothing chemically that's different between the bond between an adenine and a glycine, or a guanine nucleotide containing the nucleoside. So the fact that they form this chain is kind of like letters on a page. The letters don't have to be in that sequence. When they are in that sequence, they communicate information, but they don't have to be that way. In the same way in DNA, the letters don't have to be in the sequence they are by any chemical reason, any law, any natural cause that we know of. Therefore, just like text in a book, the code in DNA has the fingerprints of intelligence. But the nature of that intelligence, the purpose of that, how it happened, I don't know, but I can come to a conclusion at least a tentative conclusion of design, without knowing anything about where it came from. If a Coke bottle fell out of the sky into an African desert, and I was a native, you know the movie I'm talking about, Gods Must Be Crazy. Those people knew that Coke bottle was designed, but they had no idea what it was.
Dr. Jonathan Wells is a senior fellow at the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. He has 2 PhDs, one in molecular and cell biology from the University of California at Berkeley, and one in religious studies from Yale University. Subsequently, he has performed postdoctoral research at UC Berkeley and has authored 2 books concerning evolution.
Specifically, probably most notoriously, in 2000, I published a book, Icons of Evolution, in which I showed that many of the major images used in biology textbooks as evidence for evolution, in fact, do not fit the evidence. The one I first discovered was the picture of embryos, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, because I was studying embryology, and I would compare the pictures with the embryos I was actually looking at, and realized that there was a discordance there. And I went on from there to study various other icons and found similar discrepancies between the icon and the evidence. Well, the peppered moth icon, which has pictures typically of peppered moths resting on tree trunks where we now know they don't normally rest, is used as evidence for natural selection. Well, I have no quarrel with natural selection, so I'm not saying that the falsity of that icon refutes natural selection. But for each icon that I deal with, what I do say, and I think legitimately, is that if this is thought or presented as some of the best evidence we have for Darwinian evolution, and so much of it is false, where does that leave the theory? Because sooner or later, if a theory is going to be scientific, you have to test it against the evidence. And if piece after piece of that evidence turns out to be exaggerated or distorted or even faked, then I think the theory itself at some point becomes suspect.
Your criticisms in Icons of Evolution tend to weaken evolutionary theory. Would you agree with that?
The evidence is what weakens evolutionary theory. I have no desire to weaken any theory except by comparing it with the evidence. What I don't want to weaken is science. But science thrives on comparing theory with evidence. I'm going to pick 7 phyla, 7 major groups. We're in the chordate group. If we look at the molecules in these organisms and we group them according to the similarity of their molecules, we can rearrange them thus. So the molecules here are most similar. They're more similar to each other than they are to these, for example. These are more similar than they are to those. So we can regroup these according to the similarities in this particular molecule. Now, if we construct a tree, an evolutionary tree, following Darwin's pattern, based on this molecule, we get something like this. But be clear that the only data we have are up here. We have the molecules from these organisms, and the rest of this is inferred based on the assumption that they share a common ancestor. What's interesting is when we look at these molecules, various discrepancies immediately appear. For example, the tree I just showed you from 18S RNA doesn't fit the classical tree that had been drawn on the basis of morphology or anatomy. Animals that are close together up here are far apart over here. Not only that, if I pick a different molecule, 28S RNA, I get a different tree again. Okay, here's the 18S tree, here's the 28S tree. Okay, once again, animals that are closely related by one are not closely related by another. Imagine if you found out that your grandfather was not the least bit related to you, but, related to people half a world away. I mean, this is pretty fundamental biology stuff, It matters who you're related to. Even worse, if we take 18S RNA and submit it to 2 different laboratories, as it was done in this case, again we get 2 different trees. So the molecular evidence is shot through and through with discrepancies. A recent article in Nature shows that this controversy is continuing. These trees here, it shows these 2 trees in Nature. Here, we, the chordates, are most closely related to the arthropods, or the insects. But according to this other molecular study, we're way off here, and the insects are more closely related to roundworms. Now, these are not trivial issues in molecular evolutionary biology. So, the inconsistencies in evolutionary trees based on molecular comparisons have to actually be explained away in the light of evolutionary theory. They actually don't provide evidence for the theory. Now, I'm not saying the theory is proven false, but this certainly doesn't provide evidence for it. Now, in Darwin's theory, this is a very simplified cartoon of it. The phyla that I showed you a few minutes ago are up here, and if we had a good fossil record, which of course we don't, we would expect to find something like this in the past, where these branch off somehow from a common ancestor that might be, for example, some form of worm. Ideally, this is what we would expect. When we go looking at the fossil record, what we find instead is this. Most of the major animal phyla appear abruptly, geologically speaking, in the Cambrian explosion, with no fossil evidence they actually came from a common ancestor. Theory versus evidence. Now remember, common ancestry might be true at lower levels, but at this level, the level of the animal phyla, the fossil evidence certainly isn't helping us. Darwin himself recognized this. He said this actually presented a valid argument. Suddenly appear in the Cambrian must at present remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against his view of common ancestry. I would argue, as a biologist, that the problem has not been solved in the intervening 150 years, at least not from the fossil evidence. The way Darwinian evolution is often presented as though there's overwhelming evidence for it and no dispute about it. Clearly that's not the case, so I do think students should be exposed at least in outline to these problems. What does it do to Darwin's theory? Well, I think it weakens Darwin's theory. The evidence weakens Darwin's theory. But for science, that's good. If the theory doesn't explain the evidence, then it should be weakened in the eyes of the students. They shouldn't be told something explains evidence that isn't there. They should be aware of the evidence. On the way down here was finally getting a chance to read a book. It came out in 2003. It's called Origination of Organismal Form. Now, these are eminent evolutionary biologists. As far as I know, there's not an ID proponent in there, certainly not a creationist. As far as I know, all of them have a faith that sooner or later completely natural explanations will be found for all these phenomena. But to a person, these writers say quite clearly that there's a problem extrapolating microevolution to macroevolution, a scientific problem. It's just undeniable. It's throughout the scientific literature.
You keep using the term Darwinian evolution. You would agree, would you not, that since Darwin, the science of evolution has advanced greatly?
Well, then I would include in that neo-Darwinian evolution, which is just Darwinism combined with
You keep
genetics.
using Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. Isn't it, in fact, the science of evolution that we should be speaking about and not using terms that are intended to simply draw a reaction? If
No,
we're interested in speaking about science?
I prefer to be precise. The problem is the term evolution, as several speakers before me pointed out, is vague. I mean, it can mean change over time. I've seen it defined in textbooks as a change in gene frequencies. Well, that's not correct. My children have different gene frequencies from mine, and they haven't evolved.
Please answer my question, Dr. Wells.
I'm trying to be precise about the definition
It is
of
true,
evolution.
it is true, is it not, that since Darwin 150 years ago, the science of evolution has advanced greatly. As an example, Darwin had no knowledge about genetics, did he?
No, he didn't. That's why I said neo-Darwinism is Darwin's theory combined with modern genetics. If someone could show me a mechanism whereby an ape-like creature could turn into something like a human, I would accept it. But I've looked and I haven't found it. Not even remotely close. When Newton proposed his theory of gravitation, it was dismissed as supernaturalism because it was action at a distance. What constitutes supernaturalism in today's science may very well not be supernatural in tomorrow's science. That's why I emphasize the process of testing hypotheses against the evidence.
I understand, sir, but there is a difference between looking at nature and asking questions versus looking at questions and because we cannot find an answer at the moment, assuming that it had to be an intelligent designer.
That's not how intelligent design works. Intelligent design is not an argument from ignorance. What it does is it sets certain criteria by which we normally, in the course of our daily lives, determine whether certain things are designed or not. And then it argues that that can be extended to features of the natural world. Obviously, that's a controversial claim, but I think it's a legitimate one.
With the hypothesis of neo-Darwinian evolution, that there is common ancestry, why doesn't the analysis, the evidence that about the 18S RNA tree versus the 28S RNA tree falsify that? Why doesn't that do that?
In my opinion, because neo-Darwinian evolution has left the realm of science. It now functions as an assumption, an underlying given, a dogma. It cannot be falsified. Nothing will falsify it because it's just a given. It does make predictions. I would argue that virtually every prediction it has made above the species level has been falsified in the sense you just described. And yet the theory is still with us. And I would argue that that is evidence for its non-scientific nature.
We have a lot of people addressing us and saying, well, this is not science. And why? And when I say, well, I think it has scientific basis, they still argue that it's not science. Can you address any of that? Why is intelligent design science then?
Well, it's interesting. If you read the evolutionary literature, at least before the last few years when this started brewing more heatedly, Darwinian evolutionists have consistently argued against design. Darwin himself did. Hundreds of pages in The Origin of Species are devoted to arguing against design. The argument was the evidence will show that what looks like it's designed can actually be explained by natural processes. Now, if evidence can show that something is not designed, then in principle, evidence can show something is designed. You can't have it both ways. You can't say suddenly, well, you can't argue for design because all of a sudden that involves something supernatural. Darwin was excluding the supernatural and claiming that the evidence justified it. I would say if you're going to resort to evidence on one side, you can resort to it on the other. And for me, that's all intelligent design does. It says the evidence we see points to design. Where we go beyond that is a theological question. Well, I'm also a theologian, so I love those questions, but that's not science for me.
Dr. Bruce Samat earned his Ph.D. in 1983 from the Department of Physiology at the University of Minnesota. For the past 11 years, he has taught courses at Northwestern College on biochemistry, human physiology, developmental biology, immunology, genetics, cell biology, and animal biology.
The students provoked me to know everything about evolution because they came up with so many questions. The textbooks were very dogmatic in their approach to evolution, especially macroevolution and origins. No one had any trouble in my class talking about microevolution and diversity. No questions come from that. Everyone's just amazed how well that works together. But everyone has questions about how macroevolution can work. I found 11 years ago that I couldn't answer that. Now, 11 years later, I still can't answer that. And I read everything. Some of the provocation coming from the students came from the wording within the textbooks. In the chapters, for instance, in genetics, when I teach that course, the wording, the verbs, if you will, used in describing mutations is very precise and very accurate and very declarative. They, with data, are able to declare that the mutations are deleterious, that there are insertions, deletions, etc., and that they cause problems with the function of that gene. And then when we get to the chapter on macroevolution, the question is asked, and this is pages later, chapters later, the question is asked, can macroevolution lead to new forms of life? And the answer in one word was certainly. And then all of a sudden, the verbs change to what I call soft verbs.
No longer is it we know, we have tested, data shows. It is now should have, could have, must have been. And my students picked up on that and wondered why all of a sudden there aren't declarative verbs here and everything is very soft in its wording. That was provoking me. I had to find out why. So I've been reading extensively, and the textbooks are written accurately. It is a lot of soft verbs. There has to be, because there's a lot of stories of how it possibly could have happened. But there is no data to back that up such that we can say we have tested or we have produced such a phenomenon.
We should be able to challenge that.
Yeah, all things should be available for challenging. That has been part of my anger with science, is that nothing is sacred, is the norm for all other disciplines except evolution. Then all of a sudden it becomes the sacred cow. I have had an occasional outburst in class by me when I'm lecturing, when I have to tell students that, by golly, when I did my master's research, thesis research, and when I did my postdoctoral research, and when I did 15 years in the companies with their research, everything is held up to scrutiny and skeptical analysis. Nothing is left untouched. Nothing is taken for granted. Nothing is taken on faith. Everything must be proven. Nobody else gets away with that. Peer review editors don't let you get away with that. In your conclusions, you say, and I speculate. You don't say, this is the truth because I made this story up. But not in evolution. My students coming out of a Christian college are now armed with all of evolution, exactly what it teaches, and exactly what its downfall is, or its shortcomings. They know what it can show, and they know what it can't show. I would say that they're probably better armed than their counterparts who are going to the University of Minnesota, who are not shown what, in fact, it can show and cannot show. So who has more knowledge and who has more accurate knowledge? Those who know what a theory can do and what it can't, or those who are just told the party line?
So true data, true conclusions. If we want quality education in Kansas, we should also teach evolution and its criticisms. Wouldn't you agree? Is that what you do at your school?
Well, for macroevolution and in origins, if you're going to teach just from the textbook and those tenets of what it should be able to do, then you're not actually teaching the story, the entire story of evolution. You're teaching a segment of it.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Sabata, I have been a proponent and stated earlier, and will state again, like your comment on it, of empirical science as defined by observable, measurable, testable, repeatable, and falsifiable. Would you comment on that?
Yeah. Well, the empiricism is the heart of science. And once you start leaving empiricism, it's okay, but you need to say it. And you need to know the difference between what's empirically and supportable and what is, in fact, become more of a story. I'm amazed at how well the reverse engineered stories look. They look very good, and they're very compelling of how they're engineered. But they are, in fact, engineered. And we don't have data, especially when it becomes a historical science. That's total engineering. We have fun with I actually brought photocopies of my textbook on general biology where they show the primordial soup. And so I was very entertained and bemused, as always. And it's very interesting, but there are so many tenets. Thank you. There's so many tenets that have to be perfect for that to happen. And so it's written that way that all these things would have to have fallen into place. That's wonderful. It makes very nice reading. But of course, the historical science doesn't have any data.
Dr. Ralph Silke attended graduate school at the University of Minnesota and the Mayo Graduate School of Medicine, finishing his work for a PhD in microbiology in 1981. In 2004, he was a visiting scholar in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at the Stanford University Medical School, conducting research to further our understanding of evolution.
Basically, what experimental evolution does is we use experimentation to ask very specific questions about evolution. And this comes from the fact that there's probably a dozen or so very well documented cases of evolution in bacteria. And typically those cases involve a gain of function where you're able to make able to use a food source that a microbe in the past was not able to use. And so you can do real experiments with evolution. In a day, you can produce 1 trillion organisms. So you can ask questions. Now, 1 trillion organisms is a lot of organisms. When you talk about human population, we're talking orders of magnitude more than the number of people who've ever lived on this planet. Since the beginning, wherever you want to determine that. So you can ask bacteria to do very, very specific things and find out, can they do it or can they not do it? So experimental evolution, and you can model time. One of my heroes is Richard Lenski at Michigan State. And Richard Lenski has been evolving bacteria for 35,000 generations. He does this, actually his technicians do this, but he takes 2 teaspoons of bacteria and he grows them in a medium that's low on glucose, and then after they've grown, he takes a 100th of that population and puts it in a new tube. You get 6.64 generations every day. He's been doing this for 15 years. You do the math. With a little work, you can model trillions of organisms and literally tens of thousands of generations. 35,000 generations puts you in the range of what human evolution, what is supposed to have happened in human evolution. Experimental evolution allows you to ask real questions about what evolution can do.
Is it fair then to say that while microevolution has been observed in the laboratory, macroevolution has not, and is simply inferred?
Yes, I would say that's an accurate statement.
And the inference is drawn from what?
Well, the inference is, I think, you start with the assumption that nature is all there is, and this is all we have to work with, and therefore we're here, and there's nothing else that could have gotten us here, so therefore it must have worked, even though it doesn't look like it could work.
But you said you're starting with an assumption.
Yeah, you start with that assumption, and if you start with the assumption, which is what methodological naturalism does, if you start with the assumption that nature is all there is, you will produce an explanation that comes out of nature. And if it's a bad explanation, go back to your assumption. You won't work beyond that assumption.